All right, hey guys. So let's finish it up here. This is the last video. We're going to talk about how apartheid finally came to an end. So let's just do it. All right, so let's talk about P.W. Botha. He was the Prime Minister of South Africa for the better part in the 1980s. And it's important for us to just realize right off the bat that even though he did issue a number of reforms in the South African government when he was in power, they were largely really just these sort of, I would say, empty gestures that were attempting to sort of calm down the violence and chaos that occurred in South Africa, but at the same time basically maintain white hegemonic rule. I hope that makes sense. So first off, he does end the pass system, which again may seem super monumental, right? The pass system was arguably one of the most significant examples of apartheid South Africa, just in the, or symbols rather, in the sense that it applied to everyone over the age of 16 who was black, right? But really, what he's doing is he's just getting rid of a system that was impossible to enforce anyway, right? And then in 1983, he issues some reforms to the Constitution, but again, they do virtually nothing to help give any more rights or liberties to the Black South African population. Basically, it establishes a new parliament that has three different sections. In one of my classes, I compared it to our Congress, right? We have two houses in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? So this parliament has three different wings. Just think of a wing like a house. They were divided up by race, right? So the three wings, there was a white wing, a colored, remember colored means mixed race in South Africa wing, and then also an Asian wing, right? So that meant that there was still no black House of Parliament that actually represented the black population, and realized that the black population was about three-quarters of the entire population of South Africa. So they're excluding a vast majority of the population. And then the last example of reform on this slide is the legalization of trade unions or labor unions for the black population. And just a really quick definition of unions, right? They're basically these collective organizations of workers that allow them to be more efficient in how they negotiate with their employers, whether it's a salary negotiation, better working conditions, better hours, etc. Right? That essentially the gist is that if you work collectively, it's much easier to achieve your goals. Right. So they became legal, but at the same time, they were legalized again because, at least according to Botha, the black sort of strike efforts in general were just seen as a nuisance, right? So he basically legalizes a process that was already happening, especially with regard to strikes, right? Because he thought maybe it would make them more peaceful. But really, the problem with this is that when he legalizes trade unions, it makes it legal to strike. And I'm not saying that's a problem, right? But it's a problem in the eyes of the white South African government in the sense that they lose all that productivity and they lose all the money that could have been made if these workers were working, right? So basically, the backfiring of his trade union reform arguably works very much to the benefit of the ending of apartheid in the sense that they continue to use these economic strategies to bring an end to apartheid. Um, okay, education reform. There was some more spending on black education. So basically, it was again seen as this gesture. This was one of the major reasons why the youth in South Africa was very upset with the apartheid system. Think about Soweto, for example. But at the same time, still, the increase in funding for black students was vastly eclipsed by the amount of money that was still spent on white children, right? So white kids still got 7 times the amount of money, federal funding for their education, than black students did. Um, and the other thing that we need to consider is that even with some of these reforms, segregation still existed in some cases on a de facto basis, and rather in some cases in a de jure basis, and in most cases still a de facto uh, status, right? And I say that, right, here's one good example of this, right? That there still were some local ordinances, right, that actually did segregate spaces like pools, toilets, right? Think about, the Jim Crow South, right, where water fountains, things like that were segregated, movie theaters. So that actually was a quasi de jure form of segregation. But another example of de facto segregation is that essentially, segregation persisted because some of the more, quote, elite, end quote, facilities were only really patronized by whites because they were too expensive for the black population to afford them. So, in general, at least from the perspective of Black South Africans who opposed apartheid, they really did not think much of both his reforms. They kind of thought that he didn't really do enough, and he did it too late. So that explains why the late 1970s and early 1990s was such a violent time in apartheid South Africa. Right? We could sort of bookend the Soweto uprisings as the beginning of this surge and violence, and maybe, I don't know, end the bookend by the early 90s when Nelson Mandela gets out of prison, right? What we see in basically the entire 1980s is that the entire country of South Africa is more or less in a de facto civil war. And I say de facto because it was not an official war, nothing was ever declared. And I also say it was a de facto civil war because there was warfare, it was just guerrilla style warfare, right? Um, so that's really important because that's one of the reasons why FW de Klerk, when he becomes prime minister, is going to issue some major reforms that actually do end apartheid. But let's hold off on that thought for a second. Let's just better understand why the anti-apartheid and pro-apartheid approaches became increasingly violent, right? Is because that 1984 Constitution, which probably doesn't surprise you, was not satisfactory for the black population because they were still not represented. Another reason why that was, forgive me, my slides froze again. It should be coming back. There we go. So, another reason, of course, is that as the anti apartheid movement escalates, so does the pro apartheid movement, for lack of a better phrase, right? You're going to see an increase in police brutality. P.W. Botha declares a state of emergency in 1985 and declares martial law or military rule, right? The press is not able to freely report on what's going on in South Africa, and thousands get arrested. And I just thought that these two pictures were interesting to put next to one another, right? You see these two white, they actually, I should have included a captain. They look like soldiers, but actually these are police officers. It's also just interesting how young they are. And then this is I believe that this man here, no, we see burning in the background. So something is on fire. But in general, what we started to see was sort of an increasingly um, sort of militant effort to end apartheid, also from the black anti-apartheid activists. And one of the best examples of that would be how the ANC started to bomb government buildings in the 1980s. Right, they deliberately chose government buildings because of this symbolic nature, right, of going after that instead of a private facility like a bank. In addition to that, that would mean that the pro apartheid government run by the National Party could literally not operate if their offices were damaged. But in general, these bombings would take place after hours. They would take place at night because the anti apartheid movement, even though it did become more militant, they did not want to murder people, right? So most of the time, those bombings happen at night. But by the late 1980s, what you see is that South Africa was essentially in a civil war. We watched this video in class if you were in F period, but A period, I don't think we quite got to it. So if you want to, just check that out on slide 127. You do have to click on the picture, and that will take you to a website, which will then show you the video. And then we paused in the middle of class to ask the big question, okay, wait, the late 1980s, the Cold War is also ending. So how does this connect to the end of apartheid? Short answer is this, right? If you guys remember, the United States kind of sat on its heels for a little while about whether or not to condemn apartheid. And one of the major reasons why that was because of the Cold War underpinnings, right? That the South African government oftentimes warned the outside world that the ANC was not just a terrorist organization, but that it was a communist organization, right? So, for example, in the early 1980s, when the US Congress tried to pass sanctions against South Africa, President Reagan actually vetoed those sanctions, and Congress actually overrode rather his veto, and that takes 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress. So That's actually really important that they were able to gather the votes to override a presidential veto. But that's more of an example of U.S. history. But hopefully you get the idea, right? That it takes a combination of public pressure, evolving a public opinion, right, and economic measures to actually finally get even the United States to come around in a lot of ways, right? It's the boycott effort, which was largely driven by the public, that actually finally convinces U.S. lawmakers to also come down and oppose apartheid. All right, so back to what's happening on the ground in South Africa. By the turn of the 1990s, we have a new Prime Minister, F.W. de Klerk, and it's important for us to remember that he was a member of the National Party, right? At least at first, right? He will join the ANC later, but at first he was a member of the National Party. So he still is sort of representing the white Afrikaner South Africans. In fact, de Klerk, I want to say, is a Dutch name, right? An Afrikaner name. So basically, when we say he saw the writing on the wall, what we mean is that he knew that apartheid was not sustainable, right? So in a lot of ways, even though F.W. de Klerk was somewhat responsible for the end of apartheid by doing things like releasing Nelson Mandela, he also was really just trying to be pragmatic, right? Because he knew that if he didn't do anything, the country would go to actual civil war, and what would come of that, right? So essentially, um, because of this level of violence we see here, right? Over 3,000 South Africans were killed annually because of martial law, guerrilla warfare, etc. He takes action. Like I just said, he frees Nelson Mandela in 1990, which clearly has global implications, right? The entire world celebrated that moment. I remember when that happened. I was 6, and I remember clear as day when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, right? So it really was a monumental event in history. Also, he makes the ANC, the PAC, and even the Communist Party legal. Imagine, right? The U.S. I don't know if it's. I actually don't know the answer to this. I believe it is legal to belong to a communist party or organization in the United States, but I told this to F period. I just looked yesterday at a copy of the application form to apply for U.S. citizenship, and there is a question on there that asks, "Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" And that is today. That is in the year 2020, right? So even though the Cold War is over, right, the United States still is a little bit fearful of the influences of communism, but yet de Klerk actually does allow this party to exist, right? And then he also issues a referendum, or yeah, he issues a referendum to the people. A referendum is just a public vote on whether the people want to actually sort of establish some sort of resolution and achieve a peaceful resolution to end apartheid, and the referendum passes in favor of peace. So basically, this slide just sums everything up, and then we're going to wrap up in just a minute here, right? If you guys wanted to just sort of really neatly categorize the major reasons why apartheid came to an end in the early 1990s, it's this, right? One of them is just we're essentially reaching crisis state, right? South Africa was virtually at civil war anyway. This low-level guerrilla war um, was a huge signal to people like de Klerk that apartheid had to end, right? Another really good example, right, that you're seeing civil insurrection, right? In other words, what you're seeing is basically the complete impossibility of enforcing the laws, right? That, you know, so many anti-apartheid activists are deliberately going against uh, the apartheid government's policies, that it's again very difficult to even enforce apartheid. So why perpetuate it if it's not going to work, right? If the majority of the population opposes it, it's just not sustainable anymore. Also, like we said prior to this, right, just since trade unions were legal, increasingly they know how powerful things like strikes are, right? So because the trade unions are gaining more agency, right, that's also going to be a huge trigger to end apartheid. And then lastly, the international efforts to end apartheid, right? We talked about the sanctions that the UN issues against South Africa. The United States eventually issues sanctions against South Africa in the 1980s. Remember from the previous video that South Africa was booted from the United Nations in, I want to say, 1974. Divestment campaigns, boycotts. They were, I believe, they were barred from. I think it was the 1984 Olympics in Tokyo. And then in general, most international sports competitions would not play against South Africa. I want to say that South Africa was not invited to a few World Cup championships, so you get the idea. So even sports is used as a way to try to end apartheid. which is really interesting. Speaking of ending apartheid, here we are, our last slide. So by the mid 1990s, right, we are almost at least finished with de jure apartheid in the sense that the South African government sets up another constitution, an interim constitution, which basically means that it was temporary. They call their new government the Government of National Unity. You can sort of read between the lines there. The idea is that it's a government of national racial unity, right? And one of the most important parts of this constitution was that it gave every single South African citizen, at least above a certain age, I forget if it was 16 or 18, the right to vote. And that's what this picture is. You're seeing uh, all these people standing in line waiting to vote for the first time. And the first elections were held in 1994, and the African National Congress, which was now a legitimate political party, won the majority of the vote, right? So they end up gaining control of the parliament. The way that the parliamentary system works is that the majority party in parliament gets to actually choose the prime minister, right? But then they also have a president, right? And Nelson Mandela won the election for president, and de Klerk was elected deputy president, which I believe is just essentially another word for vice president, but I could be wrong on that. Here we are. This picture is de Klerk and Mandela celebrating the results of the election. And I think that is it. Now, we did read about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but to make your lives easier, I am not going to ask you objective questions about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the content knowledge section of the test, but I will create a TEA prompt that will give you the opportunity to write about that. So if you do choose that one, you should be aware of some of the big picture items that we talked about with the TRC. But this handout here gives you all the information that you would need on that, and feel free to ask me questions if you're confused about anything. So that just about wraps it up. Stay tuned, you guys, for a review sheet. You can see it right here. That's the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work on this, and it will give you key terms. It will give you the links to all of these videos and anything else that might be helpful. So if you want to request anything, I'm not making any promises. I also have somewhat of a life, not really, but if I have a little bit of time to put something together that would be very helpful to you, just please let me know and I will do my best to accommodate that. Okay, awesome. Good luck studying, you guys, and stay tuned, and thanks. Or not stay tuned. We're done.